It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 27 back then, living in Oregon, and working a job that kept me stuck indoors most of the week. My head was constantly filled with noise, deadlines, traffic, people. So I figured a weekend alone in the woods might help me clear my thoughts. I picked a quiet spot along a small creek near the base of Mount Jefferson. I'd been there before with friends, but this time I wanted to experience the quiet, the stillness, the kind of silence you can't get anywhere near town. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a folding knife, and a small propane stove. I had enough to get by comfortably for 2 nights. I parked my old Tacoma near the trailhead around noon, then hiked about 2 miles down to where the creek curved sharply between a line of cedar trees. The ground was flat, soft with pine needles, and open enough that I could see in every direction. It felt safe, familiar, and perfect for what I needed. By the time I set up my tent, it was mid-afternoon. The air smelled of damp wood and moss, and the sound of running water from the creek was steady and calm. I cooked some beans and sausage, ate in silence, and just listened to the forest. There were no people, no cell service, no noise except wind and the occasional bird. It was peaceful in a way that made me feel small, like the world didn't even know I was there, and that was strangely comforting. As the sun began to set, the woods changed. Everything that was bright and open in the day started to feel different, darker, heavier. The trees cast long shadows across the creek, and the chirping of crickets grew louder. I gathered a few dry branches and lit a small fire before it got too dark. I remember sitting there for a long time, just staring at the flames and trying not to think too much. At some point, maybe around 9 or 10, I heard something move across the creek. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of leaves or maybe a stick snapping. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. It wasn't uncommon, and I tried not to worry. I glanced across the water, but the other side was too dark to see clearly. The firelight only reached a few feet, and beyond that, it was just black. I listened carefully for a few seconds, but the sound stopped, and I went back to poking at the fire. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. It was a heavier step, slower, like someone trying not to make noise. The hairs on my arms stood up. I turned off my flashlight to see if my eyes could adjust to the dark, but all I could make out were faint shapes between the trees. The sound stopped again. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind knocking something over. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me tense up. The wind brushed against the tent, branches cracked somewhere off in the distance, and the creek's steady noise almost started to feel like it was hiding other sounds beneath it. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off for a bit, but I woke up suddenly when I heard what sounded like slow footsteps circling the tent. Not running, not hurried, just slow, deliberate steps, one after another. I didn't move or make a sound. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I gripped my folding knife tightly in my sleeping bag and waited. The steps went on for maybe a minute, then stopped completely. I lay there for hours, not daring to move, until the faint gray light of morning started to show through the fabric of the tent. When I got out, the ground around the tent was damp from dew. I walked around slowly, checking for prints or anything that might explain the noise. I found something, faint marks in the dirt that looked like footprints, human ones, not boots but bare feet. The prints were thin, long, and led from the trees near the creek to the back of my tent, then away again. I felt a deep chill crawl down my back when I saw them. I told myself it was probably some hiker passing through late at night, maybe someone who got lost. Still, it didn't make sense. Who hikes barefoot in the dark out there? I wanted to believe there was a logical reason, but the longer I stood there staring at those prints, the more uneasy I felt. I decided to pack up and move my camp a little farther up the creek. By noon, I found another spot about a quarter-mile upstream. I felt better being in a new place, even though it wasn't that far away. The new spot was tighter between trees and didn't have as much open space, but it made me feel more concealed. I spent most of the day fishing and trying not to think about the night before. For a while, it worked. The quiet, the sound of the water, the smell of pine, it all settled me. When the sun started going down again, I made a small fire and cooked another simple meal. The day had been warm, but as night came, the temperature dropped fast. I threw on a jacket and sat close to the fire. I couldn't shake the thought of those prints, though. The idea that someone might have been walking barefoot around my tent while I slept wouldn't leave my mind. Around 10 p.m., I put out the fire and climbed into my tent. I zipped it up tight and kept the knife near my hand again. The woods were completely silent. Even the creek sounded softer than before, like it was holding its breath. I lay there staring at the thin outline of the tent roof, listening. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard it, the same slow steps, faint but clear. This time, they weren't on the other side of the creek. They were right outside my tent. I froze completely. My breathing got shallow, and I could feel my pulse pounding against the ground. The steps stopped right behind my head, no more than a foot away from the thin nylon wall. I could hear the soft sound of someone's weight shifting on the damp ground. They didn't move for what felt like forever. Then I heard something else, the faint sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, uneven. Whoever it was, they were standing there, listening. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After maybe 30 seconds, the breathing faded, followed by the slow sound of steps moving away. I waited another 5 minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to look out. Nothing. Only trees, shadows, and the faint outline of the creek. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as the first light hit, I started packing up. I was done. I wanted out of those woods as fast as possible. When I stepped out to roll up my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A footprint again, right behind where my head had been. Same long shape, same bare foot. But this time it was deeper, like the person had been standing there for a long while. I didn't stop to think anymore. I packed everything in a rush, slung my bag over my shoulder, and headed straight back to the truck. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I kept hearing faint sounds. A branch cracking, the faint rustle of something moving in the woods behind me. When I finally reached the truck and slammed the door shut, I sat there for a while just breathing. The air inside smelled like dust and old coffee, but it felt safe. I started the engine and didn't look back once as I drove down that dirt road. When I got home, I cleaned my gear and put everything away. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It didn't feel like something people would believe anyway. But a few days later, I got curious. I looked up the area online, reading about any reports or missing people. I found an old article from 2006 about a man who had been living off the grid near Mount Jefferson for years, sometimes seen wandering barefoot along the creeks, breaking into camps for food. They called him the Creek Man. Locals said he was never caught, just vanished one winter. I don't know if it was him, or someone else, or maybe just my own mind playing tricks in the dark. But every time I think back to that night, I remember how close those steps were to my head, how long that footprint was, how long it stayed pressed into the mud, right where I had been sleeping. I haven't gone camping alone since. I was 23 when it happened. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just finished my last semester of college. A friend of mine had suggested I take a break before starting work, and I figured a solo camping trip would clear my head. I'd always liked being outdoors, and I wanted to get away from everything for a few days. No phone signal, no noise, no people. I picked a spot in northern New Mexico, near a small town called Dulce. It was surrounded by forest and hills, but also close to stretches of open desert. I'd never been there before, but I read online that it was quiet and remote. Not a tourist place, not crowded. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed my old Ford Escape with camping gear. Tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water jugs, canned food, flashlight, batteries, knife, lighter, and a small cooler with a few things that needed to stay cold. I left early one morning and reached the area around noon. The drive itself was beautiful. Empty highways, long dusty roads, and no billboards for miles. I stopped once at a gas station to fill up and grab some jerky and coffee. By the time I got to the camping area, the sun was strong, and the air smelled like dry grass and pine. I parked off a dirt road and walked about half a mile into a small clearing surrounded by trees. There was no one else around, no tents, no campfires, nothing. Just me, the wind, and the sound of some bird calls echoing through the trees. I set up my tent, got the fire pit ready, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The landscape was rough and wide, with big rocks scattered around and dry branches snapping under my boots. I saw a few animal tracks near a dried creek bed, maybe deer or coyotes. I wasn't worried. I'd camped enough times to know what to expect. That evening, I made a small fire and heated up some canned beans and sausage. The light started to fade, and the sky turned a deep orange before going completely black. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring a little. I remember lying back on the ground, staring up at the stars. You don't realize how many there are until you're somewhere with no city lights. Sometime around 10 p.m., I started hearing movement. It was faint at first, like something stepping on twigs. I thought maybe it was a deer or a rabbit. The sound stopped, then started again, closer. It wasn't fast or heavy, just slow, steady steps. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the noise, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just wildlife, but it kept going, moving around my camp in a circle, staying just out of sight. Every time I turned, the sound shifted to the opposite side. Felt like something was pacing. I turned off my fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up. I laid there listening. The air felt heavier, like something was watching me through the fabric. After maybe an hour, I heard breathing. Not loud, but close. Too close. Slow, heavy breaths. Right outside the tent wall near my head. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then I heard a sound that didn't make sense. It was like someone trying to copy the sound of a human breathing, but not doing it right. Almost like it was forcing itself to breathe through a throat that wasn't meant to. I stayed still for what felt like forever. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I waited another 20 minutes before daring to unzip the tent and peek out. The fire was out, the night was pitch black, and the air was cold. I didn't see anything, but I smelled something foul, like wet dirt and blood. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of morning came, I got out and looked around. I found tracks about 20 feet away. They looked human, but not exactly. The toes were longer, the shape slightly off, and they were deep like something heavy had been pressing into the dirt. I felt a chill crawl up my neck. I packed my gear fast and decided to move further out, closer to the edge of the forest, near some low hills. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or coyote that got too close. The next day went by quietly. I hiked, took photos, and tried to enjoy myself. By evening, I set up camp again. This time, I built a bigger fire and kept it going bright. The warmth helped me feel safer, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. When night fell, I noticed something strange. The woods went completely silent again. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It was like the air was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire, but after a while, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, circling, deliberate. This time, I shone my flashlight and caught something in the distance. First, I thought it was a person. It was standing behind a tree, tall and still. The beam of the light hit its shoulder, and the skin looked wrong, pale and stretched like it didn't fit properly. I blinked, and it moved quick to the left, disappearing behind another tree. I waited, heart racing. It peeked again, just its head showing, and I realized it was watching me. I don't know how long I stood there. It didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. Just standing, watching, sometimes crouching, sometimes moving behind the trees. I couldn't see its face clearly, but its movements were strange, twitchy, uneven, like it was learning how to move. Around midnight, the fire started dying down. I didn't dare sleep. I kept feeding it wood, trying to keep the light bright. At some point, I looked up and it was gone. I didn't hear it leave, didn't see it go, just gone. When morning came, I found something near my tent. It was my backpack, dragged several feet away and half open. The zipper was torn, and some of my food was gone. But what really scared me was the footprint next to it. It was clearer this time. Human-shaped, but longer, toes spread wide apart, deep into the dirt like something had been crouching there. I packed up again, faster this time. I decided to leave. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into the car and started driving. The dirt road out was rough and I had to go slow. About 15 minutes in, I saw something in the distance, standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing torn clothes. But as I got closer, I realized it was the same thing from last night. It was standing perfectly still, head tilted, watching my car approach. I didn't stop. I drove right past it. As I did, it turned its head to follow me, slowly, like its neck didn't move right. I didn't look back. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and got out to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I looked in the rearview mirror, nothing behind me, just empty road and open land. I stayed there for a while, trying to make sense of what I saw. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, not because I thought no one would believe me, but because I didn't even know how to explain it. It wasn't a ghost, wasn't a story you tell to scare people. It was something real. Something that looked almost human but wasn't. A few months later, out of curiosity, I searched online about the area near Dulce. I found posts from locals talking about strange sightings, things that mimic voices, things that walk on 2 legs but don't look right. They called them skinwalkers. I didn't want to believe it, but every description matched what I saw. It's been 7 years now. I haven't gone camping since. Sometimes when I drive through remote areas, I catch myself checking the tree line, half expecting to see something standing there, watching. I tell myself it was just a trick of the light or some animal that looked wrong in the dark. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't a mistake. It was real, and whatever it was, it knew exactly what I was, and it wanted me to know it was there. I had been driving for almost 10 hours straight before pulling off onto a side road somewhere in northern Arkansas. It was early October 2011, the kind of time of year when the days still feel warm but the nights drop into a sharp, quiet cold. I had planned to camp for a night on my way down to visit my brother in Louisiana. I wasn't much of a camper, but I had a tent, a sleeping bag, and a cheap flashlight from Walmart. I figured I'd just find a quiet spot, sleep, and be back on the road by morning. The spot I found was just past a wooden bridge off Highway 72. There was a dirt trail that led down to a small clearing beside a creek. It was half hidden by trees, no signs or fences, and the ground was flat enough to pitch my tent. The air smelled faintly like pine and mud. The sound of water running over the rocks was steady and low, enough to feel peaceful but not too loud. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and got out. The sun was setting behind the trees, turning everything into a slow orange fade. The air felt cooler already. I unpacked my tent, hammered the stakes into the dirt, and set up a small fire using the few dry sticks I could find. The smell of smoke rose through the damp air. I sat there eating a sandwich from a gas station bag, listening to the creek. There was no phone signal. My car clock said 7:23 p.m. Darkness came down faster than I expected, and by 8, it was pitch black except for my fire and the weak beam of my flashlight. The woods looked like a wall of shadows, and every sound felt louder: crickets, small cracks of twigs, the wind brushing through dry leaves. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be completely alone out there. I could see my breath when I exhaled. My fire started to die down, so I stood up to gather more wood. That's when I noticed something. Across the creek, maybe 40 feet away, there was a single light. It looked like a flashlight, faint and steady, moving slowly between the trees. At first, I figured it was another camper, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. It didn't swing around like someone walking with it. It just stayed low to the ground, moving slowly in one direction, then stopping. I stood there, holding my own flashlight, watching. After about a minute, it went out completely. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a reflection, or someone packing up, or just my eyes adjusting to the dark. I threw another log on the fire and sat down again. A while later, I started hearing movement, soft steps in the leaves. Not heavy like an animal, quieter, more careful. It came from behind my tent, up near the tree-line. My skin prickled, and I froze. The sound stopped when I turned my flashlight toward it. Nothing, just trees and the thin white beam of my light. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something small. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer than that. I stayed awake longer than I planned, sitting by the fire, listening. The wind picked up around 10 p.m., and the temperature dropped. I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The nylon walls creaked in the breeze, and the faint smell of smoke clung to my jacket. I zipped the tent up tight and turned off the flashlight. It took me a while to fall asleep. The creek kept up its soft gurgling sound. At some point in the night, I woke up again, not because of noise, but because it was dead silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing, just complete stillness. I opened my eyes and waited. Then came the sound of something brushing against the outside of my tent. A slow drag like fingers across the fabric. My body locked up. The sound moved along the side, near my feet, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in the silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After maybe 15 seconds, it started again. A faint scrape and a soft shuffle of footsteps moving away. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking, and turned it on. The thin light filled the tent. I listened, but everything outside was still. I waited what felt like forever before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was almost gone, just orange embers in the ash. The woods were dark, completely still, but there were footprints in the dirt, not animal tracks, human ones. They came from the trees, circled near my tent, and went off toward the creek. My mouth went dry. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but the beam only reached so far. I could see the glint of the creek water and the outlines of branches. Nothing else. I decided right then I wasn't staying until morning. I shoved everything into my car as fast as I could. Tent, sleeping bag, whatever I could grab. My hands were shaking the whole time. The woods stayed quiet, like everything was holding its breath. When I started the engine, the headlights lit up the trees in front of me. That's when I saw it, on the opposite side of the creek, standing halfway behind a tree. A man, tall, wearing a jacket or hoodie, I couldn't tell. His face was half hidden in the dark. He didn't move, just stood there watching the light hit him. I stared for maybe 3 seconds before I hit the gas and drove back up the dirt trail. My tires threw mud everywhere as I got back onto the main road. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station 20 miles away. Inside the bathroom, I sat on the edge of the sink trying to calm down. My whole body was shaking. I kept replaying it over in my head. The dragging sound, the footprints, that figure standing there like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I stayed at a cheap roadside motel that night. Couldn't sleep much. Every sound in that room made me jump. The next morning, I drove back toward the area, thinking maybe I should at least see if anything was left behind. Maybe check in daylight. When I got there, the clearing looked almost normal again. My tent poles were still lying in the dirt where I dropped them. The fire pit was cold. But near the creek, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On a flat rock by the edge of the water, someone had placed my camping knife. The same one I'd left inside my tent pocket. It was clean, blade open, facing up. I picked it up and saw something scratched into the rock underneath it. Just a single word carved roughly with a knife tip. Stay. I didn't stick around after that. I threw the knife into the creek, ran back to my car, and got the hell out of there. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone until months later. What could I even say? Someone walked around my tent and left me a knife? They'd just shrug. Now, years later, I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm driving on long empty highways or stopping at rest areas late at night, I get that same feeling I had out there, that someone could be standing just beyond the light watching. I never went camping again after that. I sold my tent the next week. Every time I pass through Arkansas, I avoid that entire stretch of Highway 72. But I can still hear that soft dragging sound against the tent whenever I think about it. Like whoever was out there wasn't trying to hurt me, just letting me know I wasn't alone. And I understood the message clear as day. I didn't stay. It was early September 2019 when I decided to take my dog, Milo, on a weekend camping trip. I was 26 then, tired of city noise, screens, and late-night traffic. I wanted silence, the kind that sits heavy on your ears and makes you realize how loud life usually is. I picked a quiet spot about 2 hours from where I lived, near a lake in the northern part of Maine. The area wasn't popular, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me, my dog, a tent, and the woods. I left early that Friday morning. The drive was long but calm, the kind where you roll the windows down and let cold air rush through the car. Milo, my black Labrador, had his head out the window half the time, his ears flapping, tongue out. The sun was warm, the road nearly empty, and I felt free in a way I hadn't in months. By the time I got there, the afternoon light had started to thin out behind a layer of gray clouds. The air felt heavy, like rain was coming, but I didn't care. I parked my car near a narrow dirt path, grabbed my backpack, and walked about 15 minutes into the woods until I found a small clearing. The grass there was dry, the ground even, and there was enough room to set up my tent. The lake was only a short walk away, maybe 5 minutes through the trees. I could hear the faint lap of water against rocks even from where I stood. I set the tent up slowly, taking my time, and Milo sniffed around the area like he was inspecting every blade of grass. I laid down my sleeping bag, unpacked a small stove, and hung a flashlight from a branch nearby. Everything felt simple, easy. As evening came, the wind picked up. The smell of rain was close now, sharp and earthy. I decided to take Milo down to the lake before it got dark. The sky had turned the color of steel, the surface of the water flat and glassy. Milo trotted around near the edge, occasionally dipping his paws in and shaking them dry. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet maybe, but I told myself that's just what nature sounded like when you actually listened. When the first drops started falling, I packed up and headed back to the tent. By the time we got inside, the rain had turned steady. Not a storm, but a heavy, constant downpour. I set my lantern in the corner of the tent and lay down on my back, Milo curling up beside me. The sound of the rain on the nylon roof was oddly comforting. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, it was dark. The rain was still coming down, harder now, mixed with the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. Milo was awake, his ears perked, body stiff. He wasn't growling, but he was alert, the kind of alertness that meant something outside had his full attention. At first, I thought it was the sound of a branch breaking from the wind. Then another sound came, sharper this time, like something stepping on wet leaves just outside the tent. I froze. My hand instinctively went to the flashlight. I didn't turn it on yet. I just listened. The rain muffled everything, but I could tell the steps weren't random. They were slow, spaced apart, careful. Not the quick, darting sound of an animal. Not the shuffle of a raccoon or the soft padding of a deer. These were heavier, human-like. Milo stood up now, his body rigid, tail low. A low rumble came from his throat, the quiet kind of growl dogs make when they don't like what they smell. I whispered his name under my breath, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to talk. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps circled, once around the tent, slow, deliberate. The sound of breathing faint, but there. I could hear it between the raindrops, like someone exhaling through their nose just a few feet away. I stayed completely still, clutching the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the sound of fabric brushing came, someone's hand or maybe a sleeve, sliding against the outside of the tent. Just one slow drag along the side. Milo started barking, deep and violent, and I snapped on the flashlight instantly. The sudden light didn't reveal much, just the yellowish walls of the tent glowing from inside. Whoever was out there backed away fast, their steps heavy and retreating. I could hear them running off into the woods, breaking branches as they went. I sat there shaking for what felt like an hour, my flashlight clutched in my hand until my fingers started to ache. Milo wouldn't stop pacing, ears twitching, growling at random intervals. Eventually, the sounds outside faded. The rain slowed down too, turning into a light drizzle. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, the forest looked normal again. Quiet, calm, almost peaceful. But the area around my tent told a different story. There were footprints in the mud, large ones, boot-shaped, pressed deep into the wet ground. They led from the tree line right up to my tent, circled it once, and then disappeared back into the woods. Whoever it was had been close, too close. I packed up quickly, tossing everything into my bag without bothering to fold or organize. I didn't even eat breakfast. Milo stayed glued to my side the entire time, still on edge, his nose twitching like he was catching scents I couldn't smell. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart jump. The dirt trail felt longer than it had on the way in, like it stretched out just to keep me there longer. When I finally reached my car, the feeling didn't go away. My driver's side door was covered in muddy streaks, smeared handprints. They weren't mine. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They were old enough to be fading, but new enough to still stand out against the silver paint. Someone had been there while I was in the woods. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back once as I drove away. That night, back in my apartment, I took a long shower trying to wash the feeling off me, but it didn't help. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, the sound of slow steps circling me in the dark, or the hand that had brushed against my tent. I told myself it could have been some hiker, maybe lost, maybe curious. But deep down, I knew how deliberate it had felt. How patient. Whoever it was didn't stumble on me by accident. They were watching. A few days later, I checked the local news out of curiosity. There was a small article about a missing camper reported in the same area that weekend. A man in his 30s. No foul play suspected yet, just under investigation. I didn't finish reading it. Since then, I haven't gone camping again. Milo still sleeps light, any sound at night, and he's up, alert, listening. Sometimes I wake up to him staring at the window, ears perked, eyes fixed on something outside that I can't see. I always tell myself it's nothing, just his instincts, just the city noise. But sometimes, when the rain starts tapping against the glass at night, that same chill from the woods creeps up on me again. The same thought I had when I sat in that tent with my flashlight trembling in my hand, that whoever was out there in the rain wasn't done watching. It was late October of 2019, and I had decided to go camping alone in the mountains of southern Colorado. I had been feeling burned out from work and wanted to get away from everything. No phone service, no people, just quiet and cold mountain air. I packed up my old Toyota Tacoma, loaded it with camping gear, a small cooler, and some simple food. I had camped plenty of times before, but this time I wanted to go somewhere more isolated, away from the marked sites. I wanted to sleep where it was just me and the forest. I left early in the morning, driving for hours until I turned off onto a dirt road that cut through thick pine trees. It was a narrow track, with grass growing in the middle and small rocks hitting the underside of my truck. The air got colder as I went higher up the mountain. After a while, I found a small clearing about 100 yards from a slow, shallow creek. There were no signs of anyone else having been there. No fire pits, no footprints, nothing. It looked perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the trees where the ground was flat. The forest smelled strong, like pine needles and damp earth. The wind was light, but I could hear it moving through the tall trees, that soft, whistling sound that feels both peaceful and empty. By late afternoon, I had gathered some fallen branches and started a small fire. I cooked some canned beans and sausage, sitting on a folding chair, listening to the forest slowly go quiet as the sun sank behind the trees. When it got dark, it got really dark. The kind of darkness where the forest disappears into one endless black wall. I had only the fire and my flashlight. I remember how the flames flickered and made strange shapes against the trees. Every now and then, I'd hear something crack, a branch breaking somewhere deeper in the woods. That's normal, I told myself. Animals move around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. I wasn't worried. Around midnight, I woke up. I hadn't slept long. I wasn't sure why I woke up at first, but something felt off. My tent was cold and quiet, and the fire outside had burned down to glowing embers. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not heavy, but spaced out, steady. I froze completely. They weren't running or scurrying like animals. It sounded like someone walking in boots through the forest floor, stepping on leaves and twigs. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps circled around my campsite, slow and quiet, crunching leaves, breaking twigs now and then. I could tell from the sound that whoever it was wasn't an animal. There was rhythm in the steps, a weight that matched a person. Then they stopped again right outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I stared at the thin tent wall, expecting to see a shadow or a shape move across it. But nothing, just silence. I lay there, not sure what to do. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I didn't want to see who or what was standing there. After what felt like forever, the sound slowly faded, footsteps going off toward the trees again until there was nothing but wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept my knife in my hand under the sleeping bag, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the first light came through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal. No tracks I could clearly see, just disturbed leaves. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer walking around, but I couldn't shake how deliberate those footsteps had sounded. I thought about packing up right then and leaving, but it was morning, and the forest didn't seem threatening in daylight. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and tried to relax. Maybe it really was just nerves. I decided to stay one more night. The day went by quietly. I went for a short walk along the creek, watched birds, tried to enjoy the peace that I'd come here for. Still, there was this strange, heavy feeling that wouldn't go away. The woods felt different now. The silence seemed thicker. Every sound felt closer. By evening, clouds started rolling in from the west, and the temperature dropped fast. I built a bigger fire this time, trying to push the light farther out. I sat close to it, listening to the rain start tapping on the leaves. The forest started to fade into mist. When I crawled into my tent that night, it was raining harder. The wind picked up, shaking the branches above me. The sound of rain on the tent was steady and loud, so loud that smaller noises could easily get lost under it. I left my flashlight beside me, the knife next to it. It must have been around 2 or 3 a.m. when I woke up again. I couldn't hear the rain anymore. It had stopped completely, and everything was quiet. That's what woke me, the silence. When you're out in the woods, complete silence is never a good sign. Not at night. I listened. First, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it again. The same slow crunch of footsteps on wet ground. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. They were coming from the direction of the creek. Closer and closer. My stomach dropped. I sat up slowly, gripping my knife. The steps stopped just a few feet from my tent. I heard breathing, not loud but clear. Someone was standing right outside. I could almost feel them there, like their presence pressed against the thin tent fabric. I stayed frozen again, barely able to breathe. Then the tent shifted slightly, like someone brushed a hand or shoulder against it. That was enough. I unzipped the tent fast, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness and rain-soaked air, but there was no one. Nothing moved. I swung the light in every direction, heart racing, but all I saw were the wet trees and mist hanging low over the ground. I left the flashlight on and started throwing my stuff into the truck. I didn't care about packing properly. I just wanted to get out. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped half the gear. Didn't even bother to pick it up. I started the truck and turned onto the narrow dirt road, tires sliding in the mud. As I drove down the road, the headlights caught something on the right side, near the trees. For just a second, I saw a shape standing still. It wasn't close, but close enough that I could tell it was a man. Tall, wearing dark clothes, no light, no bag, no car anywhere near. Just standing there, facing the road. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove until I reached the main highway, shaking, staring straight ahead, not wanting to look in the rearview mirror. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe someone camping nearby, maybe just a coincidence. But the thing that still keeps me awake sometimes is how quiet he was. How he moved so slowly around my tent, twice, without saying anything, without making any sound except those careful, steady steps. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't some story to tell for fun. It was a real person, someone out there in the woods watching me while I slept, close enough to touch the tent. I never went camping alone again after that. I had been backpacking through France for 2 weeks when I decided to camp in a small forest near a village called Saint Sergues, close to the border with Switzerland. It was late September 2017, the air already colder than I expected for that time of year. I'd been sleeping mostly in cheap hostels and train stations, but I wanted one quiet night alone, away from people, away from the noise of cities and strangers. I bought some bread, cheese, and water from a local shop, then hiked a few miles into the forest until I found a flat spot near a stream. The trees were dense, tall pines and oaks that blocked most of the sky. It felt isolated, but not in a bad way, at least not at first. I set up my small one-person tent, the same one I'd been carrying since the start of my trip. The ground was damp, but I laid down my tarp and sleeping bag anyway. I remember sitting near the stream, eating my bread and cheese while the sun went down behind the hills. The light faded fast that evening, and soon the forest was swallowed in that kind of gray-blue dimness that comes before full darkness. The sound of the water moving over rocks was calming, and I tried to convince myself I'd finally get some real rest that night. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The temperature dropped quickly. I had on 2 layers of clothes and still felt the chill seeping through the fabric. I listened to the forest for a while. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, branches creaking with the wind. It wasn't silent, but it was the kind of quiet that made every noise feel sharp and close. I turned off my flashlight and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. The first thing I noticed was the lack of sound. The crickets had stopped, and even the stream seemed quieter, like everything was holding its breath. My body felt tense before I even understood why. Then I heard a crunch, something stepping on leaves, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a boar, but the steps were slow, careful, too careful. Not the random movement of an animal, but someone trying not to make noise. I stayed still, breathing shallow through my nose, staring at the thin fabric of the tent. The moonlight gave the walls a faint glow, enough to see the outline of the trees outside. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between them. It was a person, tall, thin. The way they walked was strange, like they were slightly hunched over, moving with purpose but also with hesitation. I could hear the sound of the steps circling, slow and deliberate. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe properly. I just watched that faint shape move behind the thin tent wall. The person stopped for a few seconds. I could see the shadow standing still, facing my tent. I thought maybe it was someone from the village, maybe a farmer checking the woods. But then why in the middle of the night, in silence, out here where no one was supposed to be? I reached quietly for my flashlight, trying not to make a sound, but the small movement made the fabric of my sleeping bag rustle. The shadow reacted instantly. It turned toward the sound, and I froze again. For what felt like a full minute, neither of us moved. Then the steps came closer. One, then another. The crunching of dry leaves got louder. I could see the shadow stretching over the tent wall, then a dark shape near the entrance. The zipper moved slightly, not all the way, just a few inches, like someone testing it. I felt my stomach twist. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I waited. After a few seconds, the sound of the zipper stopped, and the shadow moved back. More footsteps, slow again, circling. Then silence. Total silence. I laid there, eyes open, staring at the top of the tent until they burned. I must have stayed like that for an hour, afraid to even shift my weight. Eventually, I heard steps again, but this time moving away. Leaves crunching softer, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited until the faint light of dawn started coming through the trees before I dared to unzip the tent. My hands were shaking when I pulled the flap open. The forest looked normal in daylight. Quiet, still, the same stream flowing nearby. But then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, deep, and long, circling around my tent in an uneven path. Whoever it was had walked around at least 3 times, judging by the overlapping tracks. I followed them a few meters away until they disappeared into thicker brush. I looked around carefully, checking for any signs of where they might have gone. There were none. It was like they just walked off into the forest. I packed my things fast, barely eating. Every sound made me jump. The daylight made me feel safer, but it didn't erase the memory of that shadow standing right outside. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something else. Something I hadn't seen when I set up camp. About 20 feet from my spot, behind a fallen tree, there was a small pile of objects. Old cans, a half-burned blanket, empty bottles. It looked like someone had been living there, maybe for weeks. That realization made my chest tighten. The man hadn't just wandered through the woods by accident. He probably lived out there. Maybe he'd been watching me since I arrived, waiting until it got dark to see what I had. I thought about the way the zipper moved, how slow it was, like he was checking if I was asleep. Maybe he wanted to steal something, maybe worse. I didn't stop to think longer. I finished packing and started walking fast toward the direction I came from. The forest felt different in daylight, less peaceful, more like a maze I needed to escape from. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but the woods stayed empty. After about an hour, I reached the dirt road leading back to the village. When I finally saw houses in the distance, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just got on the next train to Lyon that afternoon and booked a cheap hostel for the night. I remember lying on the bunk bed, surrounded by other travelers, and still hearing that faint sound of footsteps in my head. For the rest of my trip, I avoided camping altogether. I stuck to towns, hostels, crowded places. But even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, it isn't the footsteps that bother me the most. It's the silence after, the way everything in the forest had gone completely still, as if it knew someone was there before I did. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't made that small sound when I reached for my flashlight. Maybe he would have opened the zipper all the way. Maybe he would have taken something. Or maybe he was just standing there, watching, waiting for me to move. That's the part that stays with me. The thought that I wasn't just alone in that forest. Someone else had been there the whole time, watching from the dark, hidden just beyond the trees. And I'll never know who he was or what he wanted, or how long he had been standing there before I even noticed. Ever since that night in St. Serg's, I can't sleep properly in silence anymore. I need the sound of a fan, a TV, even traffic outside, something to fill the quiet. Because now I know what silence really sounds like when someone is out there, moving slowly through the dark, trying not to be heard. It was in late September of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Maine. I was 27 back then and had been obsessed with being outdoors. I had done several solo trips before, and I always liked the silence, the kind that made the world feel empty, like I was the last person on Earth. That weekend, I drove my old Subaru deep into the woods, down a dirt road barely wide enough for one car. The forecast said light rain, but I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get away from the city, clear my head, and spend a few nights by the fire. By late afternoon, I found a spot off the side of an old logging trail near a stream. The air was damp and heavy, and the sky looked like wet cement. I set up my small tent under a cluster of pine trees that leaned slightly downhill. I laid out my sleeping bag, lit a small fire with the last bits of dry wood I could find, and cooked a can of chili on my camping stove. The forest was quiet except for the low hiss of wind pushing through the branches. It started to rain lightly just after sunset, a slow drizzle that made the fire sputter and hiss. I pulled my chair closer to the flames, wrapped my jacket tighter, and listened to the rain tapping on the leaves. The light faded completely around 8 p.m., and the woods turned into a dark mass. I could only see what the fire lit: a small circle of wet ground, some slick logs, and the side of my tent. Everything beyond that was pitch black. I remember feeling peaceful for a while, sitting there with my flashlight beside me, the smell of smoke in the air. But then I started noticing something. Small sounds that didn't blend with the rain. It was faint at first, like a stick snapping, then a few seconds later, another one. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving around. It wasn't that unusual, but the sound didn't fade away like it normally would. It stayed steady, moving slowly, almost deliberately, around the edge of the trees. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust and listened harder. The rain had picked up a bit, tapping against my jacket, but under it, I could hear the dull crunch of wet leaves, footsteps. They weren't close, but they were steady and spaced, not the kind of uneven rustling animals make. I stared into the dark, trying to make out shapes. Every now and then, lightning flickered in the clouds above, giving short flashes of white light through the trees. Each flash showed only stillness, wet trunks, fog, and nothing else. After maybe 10 minutes, the noise stopped completely. I sat still, my heart beating faster than I wanted it to. The woods were dead quiet again except for the rain. I told myself it was just someone passing through the area, maybe a hunter or hiker caught in the storm. That thought didn't really make me feel better, but I forced myself to believe it. I threw more wood on the fire and decided to stay up a little longer. The rain grew heavier, running off the brim of my hat and soaking into the back of my neck. I finally crawled into my tent when the fire started dying out, leaving only a dim orange glow. Inside, the air was humid and smelled like wet nylon. I zipped the entrance shut and lay on my back listening to the rain drum harder on the tent fabric. At some point, I dozed off, but it couldn't have been for long. A sharp sound woke me, a hard, dull thud. I froze, holding my breath. It sounded like something heavy had hit the ground just outside my tent. Then, another noise, the crunch of gravel and wet leaves, right behind where my head was. Slow steps again, moving around the tent. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The steps stopped directly near the entrance. I could hear the soft sound of rain dripping off something, or someone, and hitting the ground. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The tent walls are thin, and when lightning flashed again, I could see the faint silhouette of legs. Not animal legs, human legs. They stood there, motionless, facing the tent. The sound of rain filled the silence between the thunder. After what felt like a full minute, the shape moved, turned slowly, and I heard the steps again, fading back into the trees. I lay still for a long time, trying to process what I just saw. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another car the whole drive-in. I waited until the rain slowed down, maybe around 3 a.m., then unzipped the tent a few inches. The fire was out completely, just a pile of wet ash. My flashlight beam was weak, barely cutting through the mist, but I could see footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They circled the tent twice before leading back into the woods. The prints were deep, whoever it was, they were heavy, wearing boots. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my pocket knife in hand, listening for any sound until the sky started to lighten. The forest looked different in the morning. Calm, quiet, harmless. But when I stepped outside, the tracks were still there, clear and fresh in the wet dirt. They led off toward the tree-line, disappearing into the brush. I packed up everything as fast as I could. My clothes were damp, and my hands shook the whole time. The air smelled like wet earth and smoke. I threw my gear into the car and started down the muddy road. A few miles out, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. On the side of the trail, near a bend where the trees grew tight, there was a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. Parked, there was an old, rusted truck, the kind that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The windows were fogged and cracked, and the bed was filled with trash bags, tools, and what looked like old camping gear. I slowed down, staring at it through the windshield. The tires were flat, but there were boot prints in the mud leading from the truck into the woods, the same kind of prints I saw by my tent. That's when I realized whoever was walking around my campsite hadn't just been passing through. They lived out there. Maybe they'd been watching from the start. I didn't stop to check. I drove until I hit the main road, then kept driving for hours, not even looking in the mirror. I didn't tell anyone for a long time because I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. But that night changed how I saw the woods. It's been 6 years now, and I still go camping sometimes, but never alone. I always stay near other people, and I never camp deep in the woods anymore. Every time it rains, though, and I hear that slow tapping sound on the tent fabric, my mind goes back to that night. The sound of steps moving in circles, the outline standing just a few feet away. Sometimes I think about that old truck sitting out there, maybe still there, half buried in mud and pine needles. I wonder if someone still lives around that spot, walking those same trails, watching from the trees whenever campers pull off the road. I stopped wondering who it was a long time ago. It doesn't matter now. All I know is that when it rains at night, I still wake up listening for footsteps. It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through northern Montana. I'd been working long hours back then, and my head was a mess. I just wanted to get away from people, noise, phones, everything. I found this spot near a lake called Echo Lake, a few hours from Kalispell. It wasn't one of those official campgrounds with marked spots and picnic tables. It was just a quiet stretch of land at the edge of a thick pine forest, not far from where the dirt road ended. I liked it because there was no one around. No traffic, no nearby cabins, just silence, trees, and water. I parked my old Ford Ranger under a few tall trees and set up my tent about 30 feet from the lake. It was early evening. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. There was still sunlight bouncing off the lake's surface, and you could hear insects buzzing everywhere. I remember thinking it was perfect. I set up my small propane stove, boiled some water, and made instant noodles. I sat by the water while eating, tossing small rocks into the lake. It was so quiet that the sound of each ripple felt louder than it should have been. As the light started to fade, I made a small fire. I didn't need it for warmth, it was July, but I liked the feeling of having some light and a bit of smoke to keep bugs away. When night settled, everything around turned black except the fire's glow. The forest looked endless. Every now and then I'd hear small rustling sounds, probably squirrels or rabbits, but when you're alone in the dark, your mind makes them sound heavier, closer. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I zipped myself inside the tent and lay down on my sleeping bag. I could still hear crickets outside and the faint crackle of the fire dying down. For a while, I listened to it all, the wind in the trees, the soft hum of the night, and eventually drifted off. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. It wasn't a nightmare, and I didn't hear anything at first, but something felt off. I checked my watch, 2:47 a.m. The fire had completely died, and everything was pitch black except for the faint light of the moon filtering through the tent fabric. Then I heard something. It wasn't the normal kind of rustling. It sounded like slow, heavy steps, crunching leaves, careful and uneven. Not the light scampering of an animal, but something deliberate. I froze and held my breath. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear the faint sound of breathing outside, soft but real. It didn't move for several seconds, maybe a minute, just quiet breathing a few feet from my tent. Then there was the sound of something brushing against the nylon, like a hand or maybe a branch being dragged along the side. I reached slowly for the flashlight next to my bag, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited, every muscle in my body tight. After a few seconds, the sound moved around to the other side of the tent. Then another faint crunch, something stepping on sticks. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe a bear, though bears didn't usually move that quietly. I wanted to look, but I also didn't want to make a sound. The breathing outside stopped again, and for a while there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard the faintest metallic sound, like something scraping metal against metal. I knew for sure then it wasn't an animal. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I stayed like that, frozen for what felt like forever. The noises stopped completely. I didn't hear anyone walk away, but eventually I convinced myself maybe whoever or whatever it was had gone. After half an hour of silence, I finally managed to fall back asleep, though it was more like slipping in and out of half dreams, my body on edge. When I woke again, it was morning. The sunlight was bright through the tent fabric. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, feeling uneasy but trying to shake it off. Everything looked normal at first. My truck was still there, my gear untouched. Then I noticed footprints near the edge of my campsite, pressed deep into the dirt. They were boot prints, large ones. They led from the tree-line toward my tent, stopped a few feet away, then turned back. I followed them for a short distance toward the woods. About 20 feet in, the prints became harder to see in the pine needles. Then I noticed something else. 2 empty beer cans lying near a tree and an old cigarette butt. I hadn't seen those when I first got there. Someone must have been camping nearby or maybe passing through, but I didn't hear anyone else the whole day before. I didn't feel right staying another night, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe some guy wandering drunk from a nearby site had stumbled too close. I decided to pack up later that day just in case. I spent most of the morning fishing at the lake, trying to calm myself. It worked for a while. The day passed quietly. That evening, I cooked again near the fire and tried to convince myself to stay one last night. The place was too beautiful to leave over some footprints. When it got dark, I made sure to douse the fire early and keep everything quiet. I sat in my tent, flashlight off, listening to the night. Around 11 p.m., I heard a sound again, this time from the woods. Slow, dragging steps, then silence. I sat up, my hands cold even though the night was warm. The steps came again, a bit closer, stopping every few seconds. My throat went dry. I could hear the faint sound of fabric rustling outside, my cooler being moved. I had latched it shut earlier. Then something metal hit the ground, my pan probably. My mind went blank for a second. I grabbed my knife, the small hunting one I kept by the bag, and waited. I heard someone breathing again. Slow, careful, like they were trying to stay quiet but couldn't. Then, a sudden, loud snap. A stick breaking just a few feet from the tent. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent in one motion, and shined it outside. The beam hit nothing but trees. The cooler was tipped over, one of the pans lying on the ground. My fire pit had been kicked slightly, scattering a few charred pieces of wood. I swung the light around in every direction, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A shape, dark, tall, standing completely still. The light hit its face for a second, and I could see a man. Not a camper. His clothes were filthy, his hair matted. He was holding something, a hatchet, I think. The second the light touched him, he turned and ran deeper into the woods. I didn't chase. I ran straight to my truck, grabbed my keys, and started it with shaking hands. I didn't even take the tent down. I left it all there, my sleeping bag, cooler, everything. I just drove, tires kicking up dirt, headlights bouncing off trees until I hit the main road. I drove for nearly an hour before stopping. When I reached a small diner outside Kalispell, I finally stopped shaking. I sat there in the parking lot, just breathing, trying to make sense of it. I didn't call the police at first because I didn't know what to say. Some man in the woods watching me at night. No real proof. But the next day, when I went back with a ranger, my campsite looked torn apart. The tent was slashed open, my stuff scattered everywhere. The ranger found more footprints near the treeline, and a small pile of ashes from a separate fire someone had made maybe 50 yards from where I'd been camped. Whoever it was had been there too, maybe watching me from the woods that whole first day. The ranger said sometimes drifters or squatters lived out there, hiding deep in the forest, avoiding people. Some of them weren't dangerous, but others, well, no one really knew who they were. I never camped alone again after that. Every time I hear leaves crunch under my feet or branches snap in the distance, my stomach tightens. I keep thinking about how close that man must have been, standing there in the dark while I slept, breathing just a few feet away from me, waiting for something, who knows what. I left Montana a few months later and never went back. But I still think about Echo Lake sometimes. The still water, the quiet woods, and that feeling of being completely alone until I wasn't. It was late September 2016 when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone on an old family friend's farm in southern Ohio. The farm was huge, acres and acres of open fields, a few clusters of trees, and an old barn that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had been there before as a kid, but never stayed overnight. I thought it would be peaceful to get away from town for a couple of days, set up a small tent, make a fire, and just breathe in the quiet. I didn't expect the quiet to turn into something that would still make my skin crawl years later. The weather was calm when I arrived around noon. The sky was cloudy, but it wasn't supposed to rain. The grass was still a little damp from the morning dew, and the wind moved slowly through the open fields. I parked my car near the edge of the property, next to a narrow dirt path that led down to the lower part of the land where the barn stood. You could tell nobody had driven there in a while. The weeds were tall, and some had started growing between the tire tracks. I carried my gear down the slope and found a spot near the barn to set up camp. It was far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear anything but the wind, maybe a few crickets or frogs at night. I pitched my tent beside a patch of old corn that had gone dry and yellow. The stalks stood like thin paper skeletons, crackling whenever the breeze passed through them. The barn was about 50 yards away. It leaned slightly to one side, its red paint faded to a dull pink. I could see tools still hanging on the inside walls, rakes, chains, and old shovel. The place looked frozen in time, untouched for years. I unpacked my cooler, set up a small folding chair, and spent most of the afternoon walking around the property, taking photos and exploring. Around 5, the wind started picking up. The sky darkened faster than I expected. The air got heavier, almost thick. I could smell rain coming, that damp, earthy smell that usually means a storm isn't far away. I went back to my tent, made a small fire using the dry wood I'd brought, and cooked a simple meal. The flames flickered weakly, struggling against the wind. I remember feeling this strange sense of isolation then, like I was too far from anything. There wasn't a single car sound, no dogs barking in the distance, no voices, just wind, the whisper of dry corn leaves, and the occasional creak from the barn as it shifted with the breeze. The rain started around 9 p.m., came down hard, sudden, and cold. The sound of it hitting the tent was sharp and constant. The air smelled like wet soil and metal. My small fire hissed out within minutes, and darkness took over completely. I had a flashlight with me, but I kept it off most of the time. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain, trying to calm myself down. But then I heard it, the first sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was a faint, slow scraping, like something heavy being dragged on gravel. Came from the direction of the barn. At first, I thought it might be a loose door swinging, but it was too deliberate, too slow. It would scrape for a few seconds, then stop. Then again. I sat up, barely breathing. I told myself it was just something shifting in the storm, maybe a metal tool falling or a branch hitting the roof. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded closer. The rain softened a little, and that made the sound clearer. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls except vague shadows when lightning flashed. I waited for another flash. When it came, for a split second, I thought I saw movement outside, something dark against the lighter outline of the barn. I blinked hard, thinking I imagined it. But then came another flash, and it was gone. I stayed still for almost an hour, listening. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the scraping stopped. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just nerves or an animal. But around midnight, I heard another sound. This one was worse. It was the sound of footsteps moving through wet grass. Slow, uneven steps, coming from behind the tent. I could hear the grass flattening, the squish of mud. The steps stopped right behind where my head was. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a while. I kept staring at the faint shape of the tent wall, waiting to see a shadow. Lightning flashed again outside, and I swear I saw the outline of something tall standing a few feet away. Not close enough to see details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't a deer. The shape didn't move for a long time. It just stood there. The next few minutes felt endless. My stomach felt tight, and every part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps started again, moving away this time. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. I sat there for another half hour before I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent halfway, just enough to peek out. The air was cold, my hands shaking. The rain had stopped, and everything was covered in a thin fog. I shined the light toward the barn. The beam cut through the mist, landing on the side of the building. Something caught the light, something shiny near the ground. I walked closer, my boots sinking into the wet soil. When I got near the barn, I saw what it was. A rusty chain lying in the mud, stretched out toward the door. It looked freshly moved, like someone had dragged it. The barn door was slightly open now, not how I left it earlier. I pushed it open slowly. The smell inside hit me first. Old hay, damp wood, and something else. Something metallic. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I scanned the inside. Everything looked the same as before except near the back. There was a fresh footprint in the dirt. It was deep, made by a heavy boot. I followed it with the light and saw more of them leading out the back door of the barn and into the open field. Whoever or whatever had been there had walked straight through while I was inside my tent. I backed away fast, my heartbeat pounding in my throat. I didn't bother closing the barn door. I went straight back to my tent, stuffed everything I could into my backpack, and started heading toward the car. The ground was slippery, and I almost fell twice. My flashlight caught glimpses of the field. The fog thickened, making everything look like it was moving. Every sound made me jump. When I reached my car, I threw everything in the back seat without caring if it was wet. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The headlights cut through the fog as I started driving down the dirt path. Halfway down, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing near the barn, motionless, watching. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept looking behind me. I drove straight home that night, didn't sleep until morning. The next day, I called the owner of the farm and told him what happened. He said no one should have been there. He hadn't rented the land out, and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. A week later, he called me back. He said he went down to check the barn and found boot prints similar to what I described, along with signs that someone had been sleeping inside recently. An old blanket, a half-burnt candle, and empty food cans. He thought maybe a drifter had been living there without anyone knowing. I still think about that night often, not because I'm scared of the dark, but because of how close I might have been to someone I never saw clearly. Someone who walked around my tent in the rain while I was sleeping, just a thin layer of fabric between us. It wasn't some ghost story or myth. It was just a reminder that the scariest things aren't always what we can't explain. They're the things that exist quietly, right outside the walls we think keep us safe. It was early November 2017 when I drove up into the mountains of northern Idaho for a 3-day hunting and camping trip. I was 29 at the time, and I'd been hunting since I was a kid, but I'd never gone alone before. I'd been feeling burned out from work and wanted a few days of quiet, away from phone signals and people. I picked a spot I'd been to once before with my uncle years ago, a stretch of rough terrain filled with pines, creeks, and rocky ridges, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The area wasn't exactly known for big game, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out there. I reached the area around noon. The road turned into gravel, then into dirt, and finally faded into a narrow trail. The weather was cold, cloudy, and quiet, with patches of snow left over from a storm a few days before. I parked my old Chevy a little off the trail, loaded my gear onto my back, and hiked in about 1.5 miles. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles, and the air smelled sharp, like resin and wet bark. I found a flat area near a creek and set up camp. Tent, fire pit, folding chair, and a tarp over some firewood I'd brought. Once camp was ready, I took a slow walk through the woods to scout. The forest there was thick, full of uneven ground, fallen logs, and old-growth trees. I found signs of elk and maybe a deer or two. No fresh tracks, though. Around 4 p.m., I made it back to camp. The sun was low and the forest had that dull orange glow that fades fast in the mountains. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, drank some coffee, and sat there listening to the sounds. Branches creaking, the creek running, a few distant crows. It felt peaceful in a lonely kind of way. That night, the temperature dropped fast. I layered up, zipped myself in the tent, and tried to sleep. But sometime around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. I just felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. Then I realized I couldn't hear the creek anymore. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I lay there for a minute trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then I heard it, a slow crunching sound. Leaves, then a twig snapping. Something was walking nearby. The steps weren't fast or light. They were slow, careful, spaced out, like someone trying not to make noise. I reached for my rifle, still inside the tent beside me. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it would echo. The footsteps stopped. Then there was this long pause, followed by what sounded like breathing. Not human breathing exactly, but heavy, deep, almost like a bear. I froze. I didn't move an inch. A bear this close would have already smelled me, maybe even torn into the tent. But it didn't. It just stayed there for a while, maybe 20 or 30 seconds. Then I heard it move again, slowly circling the tent. I could hear the crunch of the ground as it made its way around me. Then it stopped again, this time right behind my head. I held my breath. I didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound started to fade away. It moved back into the woods until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stayed awake for another hour, just waiting, rifle in hand, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have dozed off again because I woke up to daylight. When I got out of the tent, the ground around it had clear tracks. They weren't bear prints, They looked like human boot prints, heavy ones like work boots. The stride was long, and whoever it was had circled the tent completely. My stomach turned a little. I was miles away from anyone. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. I checked my gear, nothing was missing, but something about it didn't sit right. I spent the day hunting higher up the ridge, trying to push the thought out of my mind. I didn't see any animals worth shooting, mostly squirrels and a few birds. Around 3 p.m., I headed back down toward camp, and that's when I noticed it. There was a new trail of footprints leading toward my site. Not mine, these were fresher, coming from deeper in the woods, straight to where my camp was. When I reached my tent, I saw that someone had been there again. One of my firewood pieces was broken in half, and my tarp had been moved, like someone had looked underneath it. I checked my cooler. It was still closed, but a couple of cans from my food bag were gone. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken much, just small stuff, almost like they wanted me to know they'd been there. I decided that night I wasn't sleeping deep. I loaded my rifle, set it beside me, and left the lantern low. The air was colder than the night before, and the forest had that strange stillness again. I must have drifted in and out of sleep, because the next time I opened my eyes, the lantern had burned out and it was pitch black. Then I heard it again, the same footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the same direction as before. I grabbed the rifle quietly and sat up, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer. I could make out faint movement through the tent fabric, shadows shifting as someone or something walked by. I could hear breathing again, faint but heavy. Then there was a sound that made my stomach twist, a zipper being touched, the sound of fingers brushing the tent zipper near the entrance. I aimed my rifle at the door, but didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Then I heard steps again, slow and retreating. It walked away, fading into the distance. I stayed sitting there the rest of the night, my body tense, listening for any hint of movement. When morning came, I stepped outside immediately. My footprints and a fresh set were all over the ground. Whoever it was had stood just a few feet from the tent again. This time, there were cigarette butts in the dirt near my fire pit. I don't smoke. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. Nothing, just cold wind and silence. I packed up that morning. I didn't even eat. I stuffed everything in the truck as fast as I could and started heading out. About half a mile down the trail, I stopped for a second to get my bearings. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the snow just off the trail, there were boot prints, fresh, heading in the same direction I was going. Whoever it was had been ahead of me. I got back in the truck, locked the doors, and drove faster than I probably should have on that rough road. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. For miles, there was nothing but trees and snow and silence. When I finally hit the paved road again, I didn't stop until I was back in town. That night, after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying every sound, every step, every moment I lay there in the dark. Whoever that was out there, they weren't lost and they weren't passing through. They'd been watching me since the first night. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe they were waiting for me to fall asleep long enough to make a move. A week later, I called the local ranger station. They said a couple other campers had reported similar things in that same area. Gear going missing, strange footprints, signs of someone lurking near camps at night. No one had caught whoever it was. They said the tracks always led deeper into the forest, toward a stretch of land that hadn't been patrolled in years. I never went back there again. I still hunt, but never alone. And every time I camp now, I make sure there's someone else beside me, even if it's just for one night. Because that kind of silence, the kind that hides footsteps and breathing in the dark, sticks with you long after you leave the woods. It had been raining since the afternoon, the kind of steady, cold rain that never really lets up. I was camping alone in the mountains near Innsbruck, Austria, early October of 2019. I had planned the trip for weeks. A few quiet days away from people, just me, a small tent, and the sound of rain in the trees. I was 32 then, living in Munich, and I had driven down early that morning. The campsite wasn't an official one. It was a small clearing off a hiking trail that I'd found on a previous trip. There was a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, a few meters from a narrow dirt path that led deeper into the forest. By the time I finished setting up the tent, the rain had already soaked through my jacket. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, and the fog was beginning to slide down the mountain slopes like slow-moving smoke. Everything felt damp, the ground, my backpack, even the air in my lungs. The sound of rain hitting the tent was constant, a dull tapping that grew heavier every few minutes when the wind shifted. I sat inside my tent with my small gas stove, heating up a can of soup. The light from my headlamp flickered off the wet nylon walls, and outside the forest was pitch black. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, not even birds. Just the rain and the occasional creak of a tree in the wind. Around 9 that night, I went out to relieve myself and noticed a strange light far down the trail. It wasn't bright, more like a faint glow, almost white, barely cutting through the rain. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my own headlamp or maybe another camper setting up somewhere down the path. But it was odd. I hadn't seen any other cars when I arrived, and this area wasn't exactly popular. I stood there for a few seconds, rain dripping from my hood, staring through the trees. The light didn't move. It just stayed there, steady and low to the ground, too dim to be a flashlight and too white to be firelight. Eventually, I went back inside, telling myself it was nothing. By midnight, the rain had gotten heavier. The wind pressed against the sides of the tent, making it shake. Couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified. The rain, the branches snapping somewhere nearby, the soft rush of water trickling downhill. I lay on my sleeping bag listening, trying to calm my breathing. That's when I heard something that didn't fit with the rhythm of the rain. Footsteps, slow, heavy ones squelching in the mud. I froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But the steps sounded too deliberate, too even. Human. They came from the same direction as the light I'd seen earlier, somewhere down the trail. My tent was zipped shut, and I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped a few meters away. I turned off my headlamp. The darkness was immediate, suffocating. My pulse was loud in my ears. I could hear the rain on the tent roof, the wind shifting, and then another sound. Breathing. Shallow, quiet breathing just outside. I stayed still for what felt like minutes. My legs were trembling, my hands gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag. I didn't know what to do. The person, or whatever it was, didn't move. I could hear the faint crunch of wet ground under their shoes as they shifted weight, maybe turning. Then the sound faded, slow, careful steps moving away, swallowed by the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my hand on the handle of my knife and waited for the sky to lighten. Every few minutes, I'd think I heard something, a branch cracking, a shuffle of feet, but it was probably just the forest. When morning came, the rain had turned to a light drizzle. My tent was soaked through, my clothes damp and cold. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the mud. The air smelled of wet moss. I looked around the clearing. There were footprints near the edge of my campsite, not mine. They were large, maybe from heavy boots, and they came from the trail, stopped right in front of my tent, then turned back the way they came. I followed them for a few meters, just far enough to see where they led. They disappeared into the trees past the path, toward a slope that dropped off into thicker forest. There was no sign of the person, no camping gear, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was some hiker who got lost or someone curious who saw my tent light. But the tracks were too direct. They came straight toward my tent in the dark, stopped and left. There was no reason for anyone to do that in the middle of a storm, in the middle of nowhere. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack. I wanted to leave before the weather got worse again. When I started the hike back toward my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every shape in the fog looked like a person standing there. Every sound in the trees made me jump. About halfway down the trail, I found something else. A cigarette, but still fresh, damp from the rain, lying right in the middle of the path. No one should have been up there that night. The road to the parking area was narrow, unmarked, and locked with a forestry gate that I'd only managed to pass because I had parked before it and walked. Whoever was up there must have done the same, or had come from the other side of the forest. The drizzle turned into steady rain again, and I kept walking faster. My clothes were soaked through, and my legs ached from the cold. The only sound was the rain hitting the leaves and the squelch of my boots in the mud. I remember thinking how much I wanted to just see my car. The road, the metal, anything man-made. When I finally reached the car, I was shaking, partly from the cold, partly from whatever fear had been crawling in my chest since the night before. I threw my pack into the back seat and sat there for a long minute, staring out through the windshield. The rain drummed against the glass, and the fog had gotten so thick that the forest looked like a wall of gray. Before starting the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror, just out of instinct. That's when I noticed something behind the car. A shape, dark and still, half hidden by the trees at the edge of the lot. It wasn't close, but it was there. Tall, human, just standing there watching. I didn't move for a few seconds, afraid to even blink. The figure didn't come closer. It just stood there, barely visible through the mist. I couldn't see a face, only the outline, broad shoulders, something hanging from one arm. Maybe a jacket, maybe a bag. I didn't wait to find out. I started the car and drove off, tires sliding on the wet dirt. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, miles away. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking behind me in the rain. For weeks after, I couldn't get that night out of my head. I kept replaying the sound of the footsteps, the breathing, the prints in the mud. I tried to reason it out. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone hiking off trail, but deep down, I knew it wasn't random. Whoever it was had walked straight to my tent, stood there in the rain, and left without a word. No light, no sound, just breathing. I stopped camping alone after that. I sold most of my gear, even the tent. Every time it rains now, that sound, the tapping on the roof, the wind shaking the walls, takes me right back to that night, to that small clearing in the Austrian mountains, to the cold air, the mud, and the quiet figure standing in the fog just before I drove away. And sometimes, when I think about it too long, I still wonder how long that person had been standing there before I ever heard the first step. It was early October of 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in a small forest outside a rural town in northern Montana. I was 27 then, and after weeks of dealing with constant work stress, I just wanted a few days of silence. No phone, no people, no noise. I had planned everything carefully. Packed enough food for 3 days, a new tent I'd been wanting to test, a flashlight, a small hatchet, and a folding knife. The forecast said there'd be light rain that weekend, but I didn't really mind. I liked the sound of rain hitting the tent when I slept. The drive to the forest took around 5 hours. The farther I got from town, the more empty everything became. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and after about 30 minutes of driving along an old trail, I reached a small clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't a popular camping spot, but I'd read online that hunters and hikers sometimes pass through. There was a shallow creek nearby and thick pine trees surrounding the area. The air smelled sharp and cold. I could tell no one had been there recently. No tire marks, no footprints, no campfire remains. I set up my tent about 30 feet from the creek, just close enough to hear the water moving. By late afternoon, I'd already gathered enough firewood, built a small fire pit, and eaten a sandwich I'd brought from home. The sun was starting to drop behind the tree line, turning everything golden. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in months. The sound of the wind brushing through the pine needles, the occasional splash of a fish in the creek. It all felt distant from the noise of daily life. When the light finally faded, I sat by the fire for a while, just staring at the flames. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up once in the middle of the night to a faint noise that sounded like sticks snapping, but it wasn't close. Probably a deer or something. I wasn't nervous yet. I fell back asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, I boiled some water for coffee and walked a little deeper into the forest to explore. About half a mile from my camp, I found what looked like an old campsite. Collapsed tent poles, an empty can, and a rusty fire grate. It looked abandoned for years. The ground was uneven and covered in old footprints that rain had washed down. It gave me a weird feeling, like someone had just left everything behind one day and never came back. When I got back to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near my tent that wasn't there before. They weren't naturally shaped that way. It looked deliberate, 5 or 6 small stones stacked in a neat little tower about knee-high. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. It was dead quiet. I figured maybe someone had passed through early that morning while I was out walking. Maybe some hiker messing around. Still, it didn't feel right. I knocked the pile over and tried to shake it off. The second night it rained, just like the forecast said. Around 10 p.m., I was inside my tent, listening to the rain patter against the nylon. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the dim glow of my flashlight on low power. I was half asleep when I heard a distinct sound from outside. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving over the wet ground. They stopped, then started again, closer this time. I froze completely. The sound wasn't animal-like. It was steady, careful, like someone trying not to make noise but still stepping on wet leaves. For maybe a full minute, I didn't move. The footsteps circled around the tent, pausing every few seconds. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then silence. I waited another minute, maybe 2. Nothing. I finally reached for my flashlight and switched it to high. I unzipped the tent halfway and shined the light out into the darkness. The rain was still coming down, making it hard to see clearly, but I didn't catch any movement, just the wet trees and the fog rising off the ground. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, gripping the knife I kept beside me. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching. The next morning, the ground was muddy from the rain. When I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints, clear human prints larger than mine, leading from the edge of the trees straight toward my tent and then around it. They stopped near the creek, where the rain had washed most of them away. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been out there hadn't just passed by. They had been standing right outside my tent in the middle of the night. I thought about packing up right then, but I told myself maybe it was some hunter checking the area. Maybe he didn't see my tent in the dark. Still, it didn't explain why the person had circled the tent. I spent that whole day on edge, barely eating, glancing into the woods every few minutes. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt like it was hiding something. That evening, I built a bigger fire than usual. I didn't plan to sleep much. I wanted light and I wanted to stay alert. The woods were completely still, no birds, no wind. Around midnight, when I was sitting beside the fire, I heard the same slow crunch of footsteps again. this time from deeper in the woods. The sound stopped whenever I turned my head. My pulse was pounding. I stood up and pointed the flashlight, moving it across the tree line. Then I saw something just for a second, a shape standing between two trees. It wasn't clear, just the outline of a man wearing a hood or a jacket. The beam hit him for a moment, and he turned away, disappearing behind the trees. I called out instinctively, though I didn't mean to. My voice sounded small in the dark. No reply, just rain dripping from branches and my fire crackling. I backed toward my tent, keeping the flashlight aimed at the woods. I didn't go inside the tent. I sat in the car instead, doors locked, headlights off. I waited there until dawn. When the sky finally started turning gray, I got out and walked cautiously toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. The ground was disturbed. Muddy prints, same as before, leading away from my camp. But this time there was something else. Near the creek, stuck into the wet soil, was a thin stick with something hanging from it. One of my socks, the same one I'd hung on a branch to dry the day before. That was it. I packed everything in under 20 minutes. My hands were shaking so much I dropped my stove twice. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. I just wanted to be out of there. I drove until I reached the main road and didn't stop until I saw other cars again. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the woods who wanted to scare me off. But the way those footprints circled my tent, the way my sock was hung up like a message, it felt personal, like whoever it was had been watching me since the first day. A few weeks later, I checked an online forum where people shared camping stories from around that area. Buried deep in the comments of one post, I found a short message from someone saying they'd camped near the same creek years ago and woke up to find all their gear moved in the night. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. They never saw who did it either. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still go sometimes, but only with friends and never anywhere that far off the road. Even now, when I hear rain at night, I think about those quiet footsteps circling my tent, careful and patient, and how I'll never really know who was out there watching me that night in the dark woods of Montana. I don't usually camp alone, but that summer I wanted silence. Real silence, the kind you only get far from people, far from roads and phone signals. It was July 2018, and I was 29. I'd been working long hours in construction, barely sleeping, barely eating right. I just needed a break, so I packed up my old Ford, threw in a tent, sleeping bag, small cooler, and a borrowed rifle, and drove up north toward Miller's Creek in Montana. I'd read online about an old logging road that cut through forested land near the water, where people said you could camp undisturbed for miles. By the time I got there, the sun was dropping behind the mountains. The sky turned orange and pink, and the air felt heavy with that dry summer warmth that smells like pine and dirt. The road was rough, broken in places, with old tire ruts filled with dry mud. I drove until the trees started closing in around me, and when I found a flat clearing with a half-rotted picnic table and a small fire ring made from old rocks, I parked. The first night was quiet, too quiet. You'd think I'd enjoy that, but after dark, the silence of deep woods gets into your head. There's always sound, but it's scattered, like twigs snapping 100 feet away, wind shifting leaves, a faint water trickle from the creek. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat there watching the flames while insects buzzed and knocked against my lantern. I remember thinking about how dark it was beyond the firelight. My truck headlights barely reached 5 feet into the trees when I tested them. The forest swallowed the light whole. There was no moon, just the cold orange glow of my fire and the sound of something small moving through the brush once in a while, probably a raccoon or rabbit. I went to sleep around midnight, zipped up in my tent, rifle beside me. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of crunching leaves. Not close, but not far either. My tent walls were thin, and I could hear every small sound, footsteps, maybe slow, dragging ones. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. It stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was a deer and forced myself back to sleep. In the morning, there were boot prints near the edge of my camp. Not mine. I could tell because they were smaller, narrow, and went around the backside of my tent. The ground was soft enough to leave a clear outline. That made my stomach turn a little. There weren't supposed to be any other people out here. The nearest town was nearly 20 miles back. I looked around but saw no one. No broken branches, no tire marks, no gear. Just those footprints and the strange feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The day went on quietly. I walked down to the creek with a small folding chair and fished for trout. Caught one, cooked it for lunch. The woods looked beautiful in the daylight, bright green with sunlight streaking through. I tried to forget the footprints. Maybe they were old, maybe someone camped here a week ago. That night, though, it felt different. The air got colder fast. I made a fire again, sat with my flashlight beside me. The woods were restless, small rustles, snapping twigs, faint movement in the distance. The kind of stuff that keeps you glancing over your shoulder. Around 11, I thought I saw light flicker between the trees. Not firelight, white, like a flashlight beam, sweeping for a second and gone. I shut off my lantern and waited. I don't know why, but my first thought was to stay quiet, to not make myself known. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just staring into the dark, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But then, faintly, I heard a short metallic sound, like something metal tapping against another piece of metal. Not loud, not close, but deliberate. I threw dirt on my fire, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed into my truck. I locked the doors and sat there for almost an hour, waiting. Nothing else happened, just silence again, and the sound of crickets coming back after a while. I didn't sleep that night. When daylight came, I checked the area again. No light, no movement, but there were new footprints by the creek. The same kind, small boots moving toward where I'd been sitting last night. I followed them a bit down the bank, maybe 50 yards. They stopped near a pile of branches, then vanished into the thicker brush. That's when I noticed something else, half buried in the dirt near the water. A rusted knife handle. The blade was broken off, but the handle looked like someone dropped it not too long ago. I picked it up, then threw it right back down. Something about it made my skin crawl. By the third night, I had made up my mind to leave in the morning. I just wanted one last night of quiet before heading back. I parked my truck facing the dirt road, packed most of my things so I could leave fast, and sat by a smaller fire trying to calm down. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up again. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but I must have dozed off inside the tent. What woke me was the crunching sound again. Slow, deliberate, closer this time. I could hear it circling the tent, soft steps in the dirt. Then the sound stopped right near my head. I could hear breathing, slow, quiet breathing. Every muscle in my body went stiff. I didn't move, didn't even reach for the rifle yet. I waited, holding my breath. Then something pressed lightly against the fabric of the tent. Just one finger, tracing a slow line from the top down toward the zipper. I reached for the rifle quietly, and the second I gripped it, the sound stopped. Total silence. I waited another 10 seconds. Then I ripped the zipper open, aimed my flashlight, and saw nothing. No one. Just trees and darkness. The fire had died down to red embers, and my breath was white in the cold air. I stood outside barefoot, flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to hear anything. Then I saw it on the ground, just at the edge of the firelight. A small folding knife. Clean, sharp, modern. Not rusted like the one by the creek. That was enough for me. I packed what I could in minutes, tossed my gear into the truck, and started driving out. My headlights cut through the trees as I followed the narrow dirt path back toward the main road. The further I drove, the more I felt that pressure lift off me, that sense of being watched fading slowly. I didn't stop until I hit the paved road near town. When I finally pulled over at a gas station around dawn, my hands were still trembling. The clerk probably thought I was drunk or sick, but I just needed to sit there for a while. 2 days later, out of curiosity or maybe stupidity, I searched online for anything about that area. Turns out, about 6 years earlier, a hunter had gone missing near Miller's Creek. Never found. Locals said there were signs someone had been living rough out there, maybe an old hermit or drifter. People stopped camping in those woods after that. I never went back. The tent stayed in my garage for a year before I gave it away. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still think about that sound. The slow breath just outside the thin fabric, the line traced down the tent wall. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't some ghost story either. It was real, flesh and blood. Someone who'd been watching, waiting, and walking around my camp every night. And I still wonder if I'd opened that tent a few seconds later, if I'd seen what was standing there, would I have made it out of those woods at all? It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in southern France. I had been traveling through Europe for a few months, and I wanted to end the trip somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the crowded cities and hostels. I picked a spot near the Cévennes National Park, a forested mountain area that stretched for miles with rivers, caves, and old trails that barely showed up on GPS. I rented a small car in Montpellier, bought a tent, a sleeping bag, some basic supplies, and drove into the hills. The road narrowed after a few hours. Villages became smaller and rarer, the gas stations older, the people quieter. The air smelled of pine and dry grass. It was late afternoon when I parked near a clearing that overlooked a small valley. There was an old wooden sign that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, covered in faded French words I couldn't completely read. But the spot looked good, secluded, flat, near a small stream that wound through the trees. I set up my tent near the edge of the forest, about 50 meters from the water. It was peaceful. Birds echoed across the trees, and the sound of running water filled the quiet. I made a small fire, cooked some canned food, and watched the sky darken into shades of orange and purple. It felt perfect, no noise, no lights, no people. Just silence and the slow sounds of nature. When the fire burned down, I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and fell asleep to the sound of insects buzzing outside. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. It wasn't a sound or a dream. It was just that sharp feeling when your body knows something's off before your brain does. I stayed still, listening. The night was silent except for the occasional chirp of a cricket and the faint rush of the stream. I thought maybe it was just the cold, so I shifted in my sleeping bag and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it, a crunch. It was soft, slow, deliberate, not the kind of sound an animal makes. It was the sound of a foot pressing down on dry leaves. I held my breath. The sound came again, a few steps this time. Someone or something was walking near the tent. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a wild boar. But then I heard the rhythm of it, heavy and steady, like a man's footsteps. Stop somewhere close by, just outside the tent. I could hear breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was there, faint and uneven. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps circled the tent once, slow and quiet. Then nothing, just the long silence of the woods. I waited, trying not to move or make a sound. After what felt like minutes, I reached for my phone and checked the time. 12:43 a.m. I turned on the flashlight for a second, the beam cutting across the fabric of the tent. Nothing moved. I thought about shouting, but I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I stayed still until I eventually fell asleep again, though it was light and broken. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold and the ground damp with dew. Everything looked normal until I looked at the dirt around my tent. There were footprints, clear human footprints going around the tent in a circle. Some were fresh enough that I could see the tread pattern from a shoe sole. My chest tightened. I looked down the small path that led back to my car, but it was empty. No sound, no sign of anyone. I tried to tell myself maybe it was a hiker, someone lost or curious, maybe passing through during the night, but it didn't make sense. I was too far from any trail. There were no campsites nearby, no other cars on the road. Felt wrong. Still, I stayed another night. I don't really know why, maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I thought the odds of something happening again were low. So I spent the day hiking along the stream, exploring a bit, taking photos of the hills and old stone bridges that looked like they had been there for centuries. I came back before sunset, cooked dinner, and sat by the fire again, trying to shake off the uneasiness. As the sky went dark, I noticed something across the valley, a small flicker of light. It looked like a campfire, faint but definitely there, maybe half a mile away. I hadn't seen anyone all day, so it made me uneasy to think someone else was out here too. I watched the light for a while until it went out completely. That night, the sounds came back. It started around the same time, just past midnight. Footsteps, slow, cautious, moving closer. My entire body went tense. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped right outside the tent again. Then I heard a soft sound, something brushing against the fabric, like a hand dragging along the side. I gripped my pocket knife and waited, every nerve on edge. After a few seconds, I heard the zipper on the front of the tent twitch slightly, like someone was touching it, testing it. I jerked up, and the sound stopped. Silence. Then, fast footsteps running off into the woods. I waited for a long time before I dared to unzip the tent and look out. The forest was pitch dark, only my small flashlight cutting through the trees. The next morning, I found more footprints near the tent. This time they were clearer, bare feet, not shoes. The thought of that made my skin crawl. Whoever it was had been there, right outside while I slept, watching or waiting. That was it for me. I packed up everything as fast as I could. When I started driving back down the narrow road, I noticed something strange. A few hundred meters from where I had camped, there was an old, abandoned shack hidden behind the trees. The windows were boarded up, and the roof had partly collapsed. It looked like no one had been there in decades. I slowed the car down to look, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing just inside the doorway, partly hidden by the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. He looked tall, thin, with long, messy hair and pale skin that stood out even from that distance. He didn't wave or say anything, just stared as I drove past. I didn't stop. I pressed down on the gas and didn't look back. When I reached the nearest village, I stopped at a small cafe near the main road. I told the man behind the counter that I had been camping near the woods up the road. His expression changed when I mentioned the area. He told me in broken English that locals didn't go there anymore. He said there had been stories about a man who lived in those woods years ago, someone who used to wander around at night, scaring campers and hikers. Some said he had escaped from a psychiatric hospital. Others said he was just a hermit who refused to leave after the authorities tried to clear the land. No one really knew what happened to him. I didn't tell the man I had seen him. I just nodded, paid for a coffee I didn't drink, and got back in the car. As I drove back toward the city, I kept thinking about the footprints, the sound of breathing, and the figure standing in that old shack. There was no question in my mind, it was the same person. He had been out there, watching me sleep, walking around my tent in the dark, maybe waiting for something. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel and barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's pale face in the shadows of that doorway. Even now, years later, I can still hear those slow footsteps circling the tent, the sound of someone quietly breathing inches away from where I lay. I've gone camping many times since then, but never alone, and never in France.